Okay, so welcome to all of you. On behalf of the Center for Translation Studies, I welcome all of you here tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Maya Isam Kesrouani, Assistant Professor of Literature and Middle Eastern Studies at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Okay, and so I hope that more people will be able to join us. I know that many people are still stuck in traffic because of the rain, so we thought we will begin anyways, okay? So I'll introduce Dr. Maya, and then we will go ahead with the lecture. Dr. Maya Kesrouani's research deals with nationalism and political imaginaries, cultural studies in the public sphere, and critical translation theory. Her current project investigates an international cosmopolitanism of cultural production in North Africa and the Levant in the 20th century. Today's talk focuses on the intersections between literature, religion, and liberal ideology in 20th century Egypt. Dr. Kesrouani draws on her recently published book, titled Prophetic Translation: The Making of Modern Egyptian Literature, to explore the legacies of the move from Quranic to secular approaches to literature in early 20th century Egyptian literary translations. The talk asks what we can learn from that period and explores the promise that translation held for the Egyptian writers of fiction at that time. So before we begin, I would please like to remind you to switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent. And please, Maha, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. We didn't check if is this one working? Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for making it out despite the rain. I hear that when it rains in Cairo, everyone tends to freak out and stay indoors. So I appreciate your presence. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to have a chance to talk about my work in Cairo. I'm Lebanese, but my book is about Egypt. So that's why my joy to share this kind of work with you. There's a lot I want to say about this book, so it's hard to give a book talk. It's hard to talk about a book you spent years researching and thinking about. But I'm going to try to tell you its story today, and hopefully it'll be interesting to you, and you'll have some questions for me. The book is called Prophetic Translation, the Making of Modern Egyptian Literature. And I'm going to start with a little anecdote or story, not really an anecdote, that maybe will explain to you what I was trying to do. So in April 1926, Egyptian writer who you all probably know as Taha Hussein, the Dean of Arabic Literature, published his very controversial في الشعر الجاهلي on pre-Islamic poetry with the profane claim that pre-Islamic literature was written during Islam, and hence that Arabic was just a dialect and not a descended language, and that the prophets were actually speaking tribal languages, which were then collected as the Quran. As such, Hussein had desecrated the most sovereign truth, namely that Arabic was the unmediated word of God, the ultimate truth claim. Hussein himself was a very known success story of an Egyptian modernist literati. From a poor family in the village, he was blinded at 9 by traditional medicine, but he studied at Al-Azhar, and then he was one of the first students to enroll in the Egyptian secular university, Cairo University. In 1908, then he went to the Sorbonne, where he did a PhD in sociology and worked with Emile Durkheim. And he came back to be a professor at the Egyptian University right around the time of the Egyptian Revolution of 1919. So when this book comes out, he's a professor, and in 1925, the government had taken over the university. So on the 30th of May, 1926, the Egyptian Sheikh Hassanin, a Talib of Al-Azhar Mosque, issued an indictment against Hussein. At the time, he was still a professor, that he had blasphemed the Prophet. On June 5, 1926, the indictment was escalated and signed by all of the sheikhs of Al-Azhar as stabbing the Prophet and calling for chaos and insurgency. The ministry had to respond to the collective indictment, and in June, Taha Hussein appeared in court again to defend himself. He was not put in jail, but he was asked to stop writing for a while. So why do I start with this story? Because one of the main preoccupations of my book is to go back to the so-called liberal age. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the translation of the Arabic translation of Arbel Hourani's الفكر العربي في عصر النهضة by Karim Askoul. And given the work that's being done now and has been being done for a while that revises those years between 1922 and independence, I see my book as also returning to that liberal phase and to re-examining the role of these pioneers who Albert Hourani and others considered to be the engineers of the Nahda, the makers of Arab modernism and Arab reform. Now, I want to contest that claim, and I use literary translation in my book to try to do that. So I look at different types and forms of literary translation that they were doing and conducting at the time, and I try to think about why literary translation in particular offers a space of resistance, although not always intentional and not always conscious. So I try to use the translations to rethink the liberal project of the Nahda as a teleological project of modernity, as a project of progress, where we imitate and we borrow and then hence we achieve reform. And this was a tricky time that I work with. So I'm looking at the early 20th century. I do talk about the late 19th century at the beginning of the book, but really I start with 1912. And as we know, 1914 with World War I was also when Egypt stops being an Ottoman protectorate and when things change in its legal status internationally. And while there is the pretend independence of 1922, this was a difficult time for Egypt and for the writers who are writing under that time. So we have the King Farouk, who's a British appointed king, put in rule at the time. And then we have these different and quite contentious definitions of nationalism that emerge with the multiplication of political parties on the one hand, but also this great divide between the land-owning class and the intellectual elites and the people. And this is also, of course, the time of the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is the moment that we're thinking about. And in the book, it's a tricky, I'm saying this because it's a tricky time for me because I had to think about why I'm choosing to write about elites. Because these are the people I write about, who I'll introduce you to in a second. They are elites, except maybe a little bit for Mustafa al-Manfaluti, but they are elites. And so that made it difficult to assess who was reading them, how popular they were, the circulation, the impact. But I chose them anyway, and I chose them because they are the main protagonists of main accounts of the liberal rise of Egypt. And I wanted to go back and revise that claim. I don't want to give up on the word liberal, not just yet. I want to reassess it, and I want to go back to it, and I want to do that through translation. That is what I was hoping to do and accomplish in this book. So let me introduce you to the people. Those are the major translators that I worked with. As you notice, they are all men. This was not intentional. They just happened to be the most popular at the time and the most in circulation within the circles that I was looking at. So they were in conversation with one another. Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti, of course, was very famous and still being published today and still being read today. Mustafa al-Manfaluti, importantly, knew no other language than Arabic. And his translations were oral renditions that were recited to him by his friends who knew French. So just think of that. And then he's going to be my case study for today, just because he's the most fun. He studied at Al-Azhar for 10 years. He was a very prolific writer, extremely prolific, wrote a lot of articles, was one of the engineers of the new maqala. المقالة السياسية, المقالة الروحية والإسلامية. So he's a very important figure, and he uses translation in an extremely interesting way as absolutely creative adaptation. So I'll get to him. I'll come back to him. I put him in conversation with Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad and Ibrahim Abdul Qadir al-Mazini because they were the romantics and he was translating Chateaubriand, and so I'm trying to rethink how they were reading romanticism at the time and what romanticism meant to them when it came through translation. The major other figure I have is Muhammad al-Sibai, who's the father of Yusuf al-Sibai, sadly less known than his son, but he was one of my more accurate translators. So translation in my book, of course, takes many forms. Some of it is ta'rib, some of it is naql, some of it is... So he was the one who believed in accurate copying. He actually believed that we can copy modernity as it is, if we copy as accurately as possible. And he translated famously in 1912 Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. His translation was taught in colonial schools, so we know that much about impact. But the one I focus on in my book is his translation of the lecture by Thomas Carlyle on Heroes, which he gave in 1840. And he gave two lectures, one on Muhammad and one on Shakespeare. And Sibai translates both in 1911. And I do something with that. And I don't have time to talk about that in the talk, but I'm happy to answer questions or talk about that later. The last chapter deals with Tajima as biography, and I look at Muhammad Hussein Haykal and Taha Hussein, and how they're particularly adapted or used translation as intimate conversation with the authors that they loved, namely Jean-Jacques Rousseau and André Gide. Throughout the book, my concern was to displace this thinking of translation as an original being copied into a final product. So I looked at all these different forms. For Manfaluti, translation is iqtibas, it's absolute paraphrase. For Muhammad al-Sibai, it's naql. For the last two prophets of Egyptian modernity, and I'll come back to them, it was a matter of telling the lives of prophets everywhere else through your own voice. And if you do that, then you become, the modern prophet of Egypt. And so that's particularly why I chose them. The second reason I chose them is because they were all dabbling in Romanticism. And Romanticism is it's a very interesting school of thought because they were producing novels, but they were under the impact of Romantic poetry as well as Romantic philosophy. And so Carlyle is a major figure for them. Carlyle also wrote the first supposedly defense of the prophet in a European language. And so this is why his translation in 1911 plays a very important role in how they think about prophecy and how they present their own work through literature as prophets. So other than Chateaubriand, who becomes a major figure for Al-Manfaluti, Muhammad Hussein Haykal will write a biography, a tarjama of the life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, published in 1921 and 1923. Of course, Taha Hussein will talk endlessly about Shakespeare, Muhammad Hussein Haykal as well. I mean, so there's this kind of this conflation of Romanticism and also the Enlightenment with Voltaire and Rousseau later, but also this going back to the Romantics, and it all comes in at once. And so what I wanted to do with this thinking and revising of these terms that are applied to the Egyptian novel or to modern Arabic literature as going through its phases, and I'll show you some slides on the dominant critical approaches to this body of work, was to insist that in fact all of this was coming in together. All of these styles of writing and these modes of being and thinking were coming together in translation and in these different types and styles of translation. And so there's no way that we can isolate them, and that there's no way we can create a story that begins here and ends there. All we can actually do is take snapshots of particular moments of intersection. So let me just show you a little bit. I started this research in 2006, and I came to Dar al-Kutub when Dar al-Kutub was a bunch of boxes on the floor. I don't know if any of you remember that happy time. It's a little bit better today. I was there for the last 2 days, a little bit better. But it was literally all the books were in boxes on the floor, and I spent about 14 days literally writing down the names of every book and author that they had, because I was worried that no one will ever do that. And then they got a grant, and they did most of that. So actually now there's an online system and my life got a little bit easier. But in 2006 it was much more challenging. And I did the bulk of my research there, so I started there. But first, so if you look at this slide on the screen now, in the 19th century you see just how much the number of translations increased from the first half to the second half. And specifically al-adab, we go from 19, so that's literature including everything from stories, poetry, theater. It goes from 19 to 105, which is quite a massive, massive jump. Okay, so here's what I did for the next 2-3 years. I tried to compile how many of these translations were being done and where, and who were the most popular authors. So Chateaubriand, I found 8. This is done in Lebanon and in Egypt, and there was of course a lot of going back and forth between the two places, and so, and this wasn't Lebanon at the time, it was Greater Syria. So this is some of the stuff. The major names, as you'll see, are Chateaubriand, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, Guy de Maupassant, Hugo, Dumas, Goethe later on. We do get a lot of detective fiction as well, which I thought was really interesting. And of course, Samah Salim's work on that is brilliant. And then I'll get to this. But before I get to this, all of this work showed me one thing for sure, is that everything was happening at once. All these kinds of styles, and I was just thinking about these thinkers and these writers at the time receiving all of this at once and what that must have done to what they knew and their styles of writing and what they wanted to produce. So I wanted to go back and revise the adjective liberal. So I see this book as having 3 major points of interest, has several, but maybe 3 major ones. One is a critique of the adjective liberal, or trying to understand why the intellectuals, so post-1967, a lot of the Arab intellectuals go back to a moment before the 40s. So they consider that the intellectuals between the 1940s and the 1960s failed. And remember this, because I'm going to go back to it in the conclusion. So they romanticize the liberal age that's before the 1940s, which is the moment that I'm looking at. And that was one of my interests, is why is that moment a lot more promising? And what happens between the 40s and 60s? And what does literature have to do with that? The second interest for me was to think about translation itself as mediating the birth of adab. So that adab, or modern literature, is not just the imitation of a secular Western body of work that looks like the realist novel, but rather that translation as adaptation, as creative work, as these weird genres that proliferate in my book and that no one knows what to do with, that itself is the birth of modern Egyptian literature. So that was my other point or claim. My third interest was the relationship between literature and religion, and I couldn't escape that, hence I use, prophetic translation. I couldn't get away from it. One, because my authors all either wrote about Islam or wrote biographies of the Prophet. 2, because they presented themselves as prophets. Literally, Mustafa al-Manfaluti will present himself as a Nabi, not call himself that, but present himself as that, and I'll come back to that. And third, because Romanticism brought with it a promise of prophecy. British Romanticism and French Romanticism was all about the intellectual being the new prophet, the poet being the prophet. So there were all these layers that they were dealing with, and nubuwa, and it came into their work. They just couldn't get away from it. And translation became this way to think about that outside of being profane. So that's my third interest, and I'll come back to that. I focused on the novel, though, or at least on narrative genre. I'm not going to say novel because most of the stuff in my book does not look like novels, which is a good thing. but specifically because the novel as a genre was supposed to, especially the realist novel, but really the novel was supposed to carry with it the project of liberalism. So I do a lot of work on that in chapter 3 with Muhammad al-Sibai in his translation of Dickens. And just this project of the liberal individual, the sovereign individual that's born in liberal ideology, and particularly in the world of the novel, it's also the world of teleology. So this character that's born is born in a story that begins here and ends here, and is a perfect character that develops and is mobilized and moves throughout. And this particular notion of the individual does not sit well with my translators. So that's what I was interested in, is that they might have been copying a certain form, but this borrowing of a liberal individualism is not something that they do. This borrowing of a romantic subjectivity, which is something that they've been accused of by the later intellectuals, is actually not something that they do. And what I noticed in their work and in their adaptations is actually the birth, perhaps, of what I would call a personhood and not a subjectivity. And I'll explain that. When it comes to the case of Manfaluti, I'll explain that. Before I get into that, though, I want to show you just the dominant critical trends that are available of these authors and of these translations, or these failed translations, as most critics call them. So, of course, we have the famous and super helpful account. I am not in any way undermining the work of any of these wonderful critics, but I'm just interested in how they keep referring to this body of work as failed. And so for Taha Badr, you know, there are three stages of the development of the novel, and there's artistic novel, there's a didactic novel where he lumps Al-Manfaluti with Farah Hantoun. It's a lesser form, it's not a good enough novel. And then you have the artistic novel, which makes things a little bit better. It's affected by Goethe, again, German Romanticism. And then you have the novel of subjective translation, where he puts people like Muhammad Hussein Haykal, Zainab, and all of that. Throughout, though, the translations are failed imitations. So all of the work of translation that was being done was just a practice to get to these other forms as they develop, and of course reach their culmination with Naguib Mahfouz. For Badawi as well, translations, adaptations, and neoclassicism, particularly that chapter of his book, translations are described as failed imitations. For Sabri Hafiz as well, they were important, but they were failures. And you see this language repeating itself. Other critics like Samah Salim, of course, has been trying to redeem or to bring back the worth of the popularity of this body of work and the fact that it was in circulation. How can we read it from a socio-historical perspective? But the majority of accounts still believes that the mature Arabic novel, that these translations were a stepping stone towards the mature form of the Arabic novel. And that to me, and then there's just more examples here that I can tell you more about later. That to me is interesting because it presumes or assumes or adopts the language of the teleology of the Nahda. It takes on the language of modernity as a language of development. So these were my motivating questions, is what can we learn from these works? What can we learn from translations? Especially against what we think the translators thought, or who we think the translators were, these liberal pioneers who engineered reform. So what can close reading do of literature to undo some of the accusations or some of the ways in which Taha Hussein, for example, has been repeatedly accused over the years of being too secular and too liberal and too Western and too... What if we move away from that? What if we're less concerned with this kind of imperialism and colonial, post-colonial, and who does what better than what? And we think instead of this work on its own terms. In an atmosphere where specifically this was the fear of fiction. So the famous Al-Muqtataf in 1882, in the editorial said, if we were to examine the anxiety of the young, we would find that the root of the problem is the kind of love relationships young people commit themselves to at an early age. Novels and poetry dealing with love themes and the like can only make matters worse. This kind of writing is addictive. One thing leads to another, and the end result would be a waste of time and a lowering of standards. These desires must be curbed. Now this is, I mean, it's funny, but it's not very different from how the novel was seen, you know, in Europe. It was a lesser form. It was a lower form. So a lot of the reason why these texts were rejected at the time, or at least rejected by good adab and by scholars of Al-Azhar, was the threat to public morality. You know, they posed a threat. And in posing a threat, they are the most interesting, because why would they pose a threat precisely? And then you see the authors and the translators continuously trying to defend what they're doing, defend their project against multiple authorities and against the original text. So translation, in the way that I see it, or the way that I'm dealing with it in my work, exaggerates the original text's foreignness. Some of the early translations actually do not even mention the name of the original author or even the title at all. And some of them do. Some of them were not translations that then claimed to be translations to escape censorship. So you see the playfulness. Not only was the novel and this new poetry as a genre playful, but also translation was playful. It was politically empowering. And it promised all these different things and all this, you know, different potential for all the writers in question. The other thing it allowed them to do was negotiate with the terms of European thought that they were borrowing or that they were encountering. And this, to me, was extremely interesting. So when I use the word prophetic, I don't think of it as a transcendental position at all. This is not transcendental, it's analytical. It's a position from within the text, assumed within the text. So whether they are writing about Islam, or whether they are presenting themselves as cultural prophets, or whether they are using romanticism to think about language in this way where it can be prophetic and create change and change the world, and whatever level of prophecy they were working with, it was not transcendental. So all these accusations against them, and there are many, many accusations of how they are too secular, they're too liberal, are less interesting. They're less interesting than the fact that they understood what they were doing as a function of language, as within language, and as a literary promise, and a literary promise that was coming for them in and through translation. So while many critics say, for example, that these particular translators that I'm telling you about are secularizing because they humanize the prophet in their accounts. So when they write accounts of the biography of the prophet, they humanize him. And humanizing the prophet is a Western ploy, and that's part of, you know, just being liberal. I read all of their works together. So I take that biography of the Prophet, I read it with the other tarajim that they were doing, I read it with their own practice of translation and their own theories of translation. And rather than just read this text as definitive of that kind of secularizing gesture, I try to rethink what secular meant, or even if it's worth it at all to hold on to the adjective secular in this context. And maybe it would be more interesting to think about what they were doing to narrative voice and what they were doing to personhood, and, you know, what kind of styles were they using? Why were they shifting pronouns? I mean, a super interesting thing, for example, is when Muhammad al-Sibai translates Dickens, he refuses to use the omniscient narrator. Refuses. And instead of the omniscient narrator, he puts Allah. You know, as Allah wants, kama yurid Allah. So it's always like this kind of, there's a discomfort, you know. I'm not comfortable with the ideas of individualism. I'm not comfortable with the ideas of liberalism. And so I'm going to do something about it. And whether I'm doing that consciously or not matters less to me in my analysis. What actually matters to me is the fact that the translation is doing it. So if we were just to read their other works and their political pronouncements as, yes, they are these secular demons, we will miss out on this other labor that was happening at the same time. And hopefully, this was what the book was trying to do. In doing that, it tries to rethink this reformist agenda. So this ideals of reform that they had were never absolute. And they were never achieved fully because they were always, you know, and in chapter 4, specifically with Hussein and Haykal, because Haykal translates Rousseau, I talk a lot about the stuttering self. You know, so it's almost like the self is trying to speak. And Rousseau was famous for changing his mind. And in his own confessions, he would constantly pretend to be other people. And it's almost contagious for Haykal because he starts to do the same thing. He starts to do the same thing when he's quoting Rousseau and writing the life of Rousseau. And it's this multiple selves, this mirroring that goes on endlessly. That's fantastic and so playful and so empowering. And that's one thing for me, instead of thinking about this as a failure to produce subjectivity in the text, which is what they're accused of, I think of it as a success. It's a failure to produce a coherent subjectivity because you just can't. You just can't. There are all these languages that are speaking to you and with you at the same time. You just can't, and why would you? So rather than measuring this against another standard, I want to say, no, there is no other standard. It's just what these translations are doing and what they're doing through and with translation. So whatever they think is absolute emulation of an ideal, the translation shows you is always deficient and is always going to fall short and is always going to be less. And that is okay, and that is fine, and that is still worth reading, and that is still worth thinking about. So, importantly, this is a moment before, post-1967, Islamic discourse becomes an intertext in the Arabic novel, meaning we begin to see a lot of representations of Islam on the streets, in Najib Mahfouz and in other writers. This is a moment before that for me. So this is a moment where Islam is taken up almost formally within the text. So when the authors are negotiating with translation and adapting these new forms, they're also thinking about the forms that they know and what's familiar to them from their Azarite education. And so one of the ways you see that is in the use of the frame tale, for example, and the qala, and the distancing, this orality that keeps coming back into the text, and also in the use of bayan. So on that note, I'll come to my example. So I want to end the talk with giving the example of Al-Manfaluti. And again, I chose him not in any way because he represents translation, but because he represents translation. He's someone who didn't know any other language than Arabic. Translation is absolutely creative in his world, but he insisted on it, and he used it, and he thought about it critically, and that's why he's one of the most fascinating figures for me. He was also known as Imam al-Bayan. So that's him, that's Mustafa al-Manfaluti. This is a list of his works, and I'll just want to read to you the introduction to Ash-Sha'ir, and then I'll tell you about his being Imam al-Bayan. So in the introduction to Ash-Sha'ir, the poet, which is published in 1921, and his adaptation of Edmond Rostand's Cyrano de Bergerac, and he does actually give credit to the author, but he says, I've tried to abide by the original in its entirety and controlled myself to only remove sentences that were of no importance or added only expressions that were necessary for the context. He who reads the Arabicized version is reading the actual French original. I changed it from a play into a short story so that the reader can see it on paper as the audience sees it in the theater. And I thought that was brilliant. I mean, this guy is doing genre theory and criticism way before genre theory and criticism. Now, he was known as Imam al-Bayan for a reason. He was trained in al-Bayan. And actually, the conservative writers of the early 20th century, like Ahmad Hassan al-Zayyad, celebrated Manfaluti as the best writer who actually did taqweem of our usloob. He thought that the Syrian immigrants destroyed Arabic with their translations, and Manfaluti came to save the day. So he was quite loved by the conservative writers and the classicists. He also was this figure that everyone else had a relationship with. So Taha Hussein loved him, then hated him, then loved him. Taha Hussein wrote about 12 articles about his relationship with Manfaluti in a matter of 2 years. Mahmoud al-Aqad and al-Mazini as well. So they attacked him several times in Uslub al-Manfaluti, that he was not, his writing cannot be real because he doesn't base it on real situations that he could be in. The realists hated him, absolutely hated him. So Madhab al-Haqa'iq, which was very popular at the time, for example, Isa Abed, who wrote this Manifesto on Realism. This is chapter 2 of my books. It's a very, very fun chapter, I have to say. He wrote this introduction to his collection of stories, Ihsan Hanim, and he calls it the dossier of realism. So realism is a dossier, and literally it's a language of scientific investigation. The realists believed that they could use language to represent a thing fully, as it is, realistically, in the world, and that would produce revolution and change. They believed that language itself would disappear as a mediator. There would be no problem of representation. Their issue with al-Manfaluti was that he was too detailed, too romantic to produce any universal truth. So that's what the realists thought. The romantics, who are represented by al-Aqad and al-Mazini, disliked him because they thought that he was too much of he used rhetoric too much, Imam al-Bayan, right? So he used bayan too much. He was too concerned with form. That kind of took away from the subjectivity of the writer. So they refused to call him a katib. He was a qa'il, a sayyir, mutahaddith. He called himself a katib. But he was the only one. What's interesting in the polemic, and they all have this issue with him, is they all use the word mutarjam, but they use it not at all to mean translation. That's what's interesting. So for al-Manfaluti, al-mutarjam is a bad thing, because al-afkar al-mutarjama are the thoughts that try to reproduce an original idea immediately in the Arabic, but do not really consider that the Arabic should take precedent over it. So if it's mutarjama, it's bad expression. That's Manfaluti's equation. For al-Mazini and al-Aqad, mutarjama had something to do with taqlid, because they supposedly rejected the tradition. They did not, by the way, as I also show in chapter 2. But they're notoriously known for being the rebels who reject the tradition. So anything that's mutarjama for them, or mutarjam, is taqlid. And, they stay away from that. For Muhammad Hussein Haykal, mutarjam is interpreted, not translated. So it's very interesting. And that's why I was interested in the book and doing the theory and the practice. So Manfaluti himself writes several articles, specifically for Al-Mu'ayyad. He writes them between 1911 all the way to his death. But they get collected in Al-Nazarat, Nazarat volume 1, 2, and 3. The first chapter of Al-Nazarat is where I think he lays out his theory of translation. And it is also a theory of prophecy. So he begins by calling on his poor memory, placing himself in the line of the prophet. So I don't remember anything, but, things just come to me, al-wahi. And then al-ifda'. So wahi ifda. He narrates, he gives the secret away. He is a vessel. He represents himself as a vessel. What's interesting is that source of inspiration that's coming to him is in fact not deity and not the divine, but is the translated text. So he's getting this wahi from this other origin. It comes to him, and because he's the katib, he receives this vision, and then he relays it. What's fascinating about what he does in Al-Nazarat, because he's talking about translation through all of this, so the way that he receives this message is communicated through what he believes is good translation and what he believes is bad translation. For him, bad translation is literal translation. It's bad. If you stick to the original the way that it is, then you are going to produce a text that is incoherent in Arabic. And it's kind of like Walter Benjamin, for those of us who are familiar. It's a very similar approach to translation where, it's almost like Al-Faluti understood that. He understood that accurate and perfect translation was impossible. And why would you do that anyway? That somehow you should read something, or in his case, hear it, have the impression, and then relay the impression in a different genre and a different structure. So that was one of the fascinating things. The other fascinating thing was his concern with the community. For him, the prophetic message has a community of receivers. If there is no community of receivers, there is no message. So while he produces this I, ana, of the katib, it's not a subjective I. It's an I that is produced in conversation with those receiving it. Hence his use of bayan. His use of bayan is because it's familiar. These are forms that are familiar and could be received by the community. And he actually says that in Al-Nazarat in several places, but mostly in this particular chapter. So it's interesting because he seems to have understood mediation differently from the realists. He seems to have understood that what they're producing is a theory of expression, that the approach to translation is also an approach to expression. How do we express? How do we write? How do we produce language in the form of fiction or poetry that represents something? And what do we assume if we think that this language is transparent? So if the realists believe their language is transparent, that they're just holding up a mirror to the world, what are they assuming about the language that they're using? I found that Manfaluti, then I put, of course, his theory across with his actual translations. The way that he plays with the text, the way that he changes ideals of European romanticism, it's almost like he treats romanticism realistically. He isolates the elements of romanticism from subjectivity to individuality, to all of those elements, and represents them realistically in real forms, in ways that bump up against what receivers know of the tradition and what this new other text is bringing in. So I'll give you an example. This is from his adaptation of Chateaubriand's. He adopts Chateaubriand's René and Atala into a short aphoristic story called Ash-Shuhada. In the book, I also talk about his translation of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, which is perhaps his most accurate, meaning it kind of stays a novel. But in that, he also does this, he puts in a lot of the qala, he inserts an oral narrator inside the text. He produces critiques of colonialism, while of course the original doesn't. So he's kind of a savvy translator. But in the adaptation of Chateaubriand, he takes the subjective he and objectifies it. And he objectifies it both as a thing in the world, but also formally in terms of sound. So I'll read it in Arabic, and then وإذا هو excuse me وإذا هو نفسه قطعة من تلك القطع هائمة بينها هيمان الروح الحائر هو قطع. So he becomes a part, a physical part, قطعة. of this al-hayaman al-ha'ir. So he takes this ideal of the frustrated self, the negative self of the enlightenment, and he literally objectifies it. الحائر في ظلمات القبور فما قد يعرف مكانه منها فمشى في ذلك المعترك المائج يفتش عن نفسه ويتلمسها بيده تلمسا حتى سمع صلصلة السلسلة الملتفة على قدميه فوجدها وكان قد أجهده المسير فتساقط على نفسه باكيا منتحبا. And he does that a lot. He does that throughout the translations, using the rhymes, using the repetition of the alliteration, but also objectifying. So any kind of interiority, any kind of moment in Chateaubriand where the self is solipsistic or falls on itself, becomes this moment of objectivity, this moment where the self is externalized. And then I found, interestingly, that a lot of the critics of Al-Manfaluti say that about his maqalat as well, that he externalizes sentiment, because that was a more familiar way of presenting that form to his audience. So I'll end with this, because Manfaluti gives us a good example because of his popularity, because of his circulation, because of his popularity even today. And my journey through the bookstores of Cairo, I still see Manfaluti on the shelves. People still read him. He's still popular. I also incidentally saw a lot of the translations that I write about being reprinted today by other translators. So I also thought that was interesting, like Voltaire and Rousseau. And so they seem to be making a comeback. And I'll need to think about why. And then read them to see what they're doing now, because what these people were doing was perhaps slightly different, but extremely interesting, extremely interesting. So I'll end with this. And this is the moment at the beginning. I'll fast forward to 1954, when Taha Hussein is put on another form of trial. In 1954, 1955, Taha Hussein has this debate with Raif Khouri, who was a Marxist Lebanese critic, and the debate is published in Al-Adab, which is a Beiruti journal. And basically, this moment in criticism seems to signal the end of the intellectuals, the end of the Arab intellectuals. Suqut al-adib is what they call it, the fall of the intellectual. And it seems like the attack of the communist writers post the 50s on the generation of Taha Hussein is specifically because they were too subjective. They did not concern themselves with collective criticism or the production of a collective identity. That's the accusation against them. And that's what Taha Hussein is accused of when he's put on trial in this particular moment with Raif Khouri. This, to me, is the misinheritance of liberal thought. This is a moment when I want to contest in my book. And my purpose is not to redeem the translators or to say in any way that they were not secular liberalists. My point is to say I care less about that, and I care more about what literary translation was enabling them to do. What are the ways in which they were challenging subjectivity? What are the ways in which they were speaking to the collective in ways that don't sound like Naguib Mahfouz, but sound different, but are still doing that same thing and doing it on the level of form. So that was the incentive and the motive behind the book, and looking at all these different styles and different attitudes towards translation. And in the end, I just really learned that translation shows us that we're almost condemned to paraphrase our own ideas forever. So thank you. In the words of...
So thank you, Maya, for a very beautiful, a very dense, and a very stimulating lecture. So the floor is now open for questions or comments or contributions. There is a mic here. Yes, so there is a question. Do you have, yes?
Thank you very much. How is a poet seen as a prophet?
How is that, sorry?
Poet seen as a prophet.
For whom? Because they all had different formulations of that.
For all, I guess. Can you explain how the
Sure, I
prophet
mean,
is seen as a...
sure. So in British Romanticism, this is a pretty famous. So Shelley declared the poet to be a prophet, and for the Romantics, the poet is a prophet because the poet brings in new symbols and new ways of using language to represent the world, and that carries with it the force of creation and the force of being creative. Now, for the British Romantics, they were writing at a time when, of course, you know, this is right after the Revolution, the French Revolution, and then it moves into the 19th century. So there was this promise that we've killed God, and now the poet will be the new prophet. So now the new language will come from our writers. This is what comes into translation with the Diwani poets especially. So especially with Al-Aqad and Al-Mazini, they're very influenced. I mean, they use Shelley's dictum in their Diwan. So they published their Diwan in 1921, Diwan fi Sha'r al-Arabi, where they lay out their romantic manifesto. And Romanticism has different forms in the Arab world. So there's their group, the Diwan group, there's the Apollo group, and then there's, of course, the Mahjar group, with Khalil Gibran and others who are writing and they're all different. So I explained that in the book. They come from very different schools. Manfaluti himself sounds more like German Romanticism, but all of these groups of romantics believed in the prophecy of the poet, that the poet would produce new symbols and destroy the old ones, and that all that promise was in the figure of the poet. Now, when it comes to Arabic, and that's my argument, it doesn't get translated exactly like that they don't borrow it exactly like that they change it and they temper it. They still believe that there is agency in writing and in literature producing new worlds, but not at the expense of replacing the prophet. And this is the tension that I try to deal with in the book, that imitating the prophet is an ideal to strive towards, but never to achieve. And that's why for them, prophecy, even as poets, will always fail. It won't really be what the Romantics thought it would be for them.
So when Khalil Gibran went to America, he wrote the prophet, or he became prophet, or what?
He wrote the prophet, declared himself to be kind of a prophet, but Gibran was affected by Nietzsche, which is not what the Egyptian writers were affected by. They were not reading Nietzsche. They were reading the British poets. So it's just a different philosophy. German had a different idea of prophecy.
Okay, so maybe if there are other questions in the audience, sorry, you want to, yeah? Maybe if there are...
I think Humphrey had a question.
Yeah, there's a question here. I'm sorry because the student who was going to help with the mic couldn't come because of the rain. So if we can just, there's a question here. Yeah, Humphrey.
Thank you. First of all, let me say how wonderful it is to hear a lecture that really opens new perspectives on a subject. How wonderful and how rare. I mean, I really feel that you've given us an enormous amount to think about. My question, after, a somewhat perhaps workaday or banal question, but nevertheless it interests me. The translators, what was the world of the translators in terms of the sorts of channels they had for publication of their work? What other kinds of literature were the people who published them also publishing? And was there any relationship between the two? Was there any dynamic between non-translated works published by Il-Mu'ayyad, for example, or published by any publisher, and the sorts of translators that the same publisher was willing or interested in publishing? And is there any ideological foundation, to all that? And since I have the microphone, let me get in a second question, may I? Take a 19th century translators like Osman Galel, translated a lot of Molière. Mm-hmm. He did it, I believe, entirely in colloquial. Yes. Do any of your translators dabble with that? And what would have been what was that? Did they have any declared stances with regard to the kind of the variety of language that they should be using, quite apart from the specific style, form, and so on?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for these beautiful questions. I'll start with the second one. This was one of the major challenges in adapting the novel, actually, because all of these translators, the one I work with, rejected العامية. They wanted to use Fusha strictly. Now, that being said, sometimes against their own wishes, they did falter and they would use. So for Muhammad al-Sibai, it was absolutely unacceptable to use al-Ammiya, but then sometimes he did, and he would say in essays that I cite in the book that he just had to. Like, there are moments when he just had to do it because it won't carry the sentiment. Taha Hussein felt very strongly against the colloquial, mostly because, for many reasons, but also because there's a talk that he gave in the 50s that I cite in the book, and there's actually a YouTube video of the talk, which is super interesting, where I think he was giving the talk in, I want to say Algeria, or he was talking to Algerian intellectuals, but his point was that if we use the colloquial, we alienate the rest of the Arab world. And so for Arab unity, we had to use Fusha. Manfaluti was Imam al-Bayan. I mean, but he also slipped as well. And I love those moments of slipping because that's also those different registers. One of the things I was fascinated by was how all these discourses that are running in the background for them, like all these things they're learning, their education, whether it's their Islamic education or their colonial education or their French education, everything seems to be exposed in their translations. So nothing is taken for granted. No claim to truth is just obvious. It's always contested somehow, whether they change pronouns like As-Sibai does, or they want to use Fusha and then suddenly there's this Ammiya word that comes in, or suddenly they adapt an English word in Arabic. So it's like this space of contesting. There's constantly things being contested within the space of their translations. So that's one thing I'll say to that. As to your first question, a lot of these writers were also writing other stuff in the same journals. So not only were there's other writing from other people, but there was also their writing. And it is very interesting because there is a very noticeable difference between what Taha Hussein will say in his maqalat in the same places that he will say in his livre de poche translations. There is a difference. And that's what I thought was super fascinating. For example, in the introduction to most of his livres de poche, these translations that were like circulated for the public, they were not accurate at all. And he would say, these translations are not accurate. They're not supposed to render the original as it is. They're supposed to reproduce a lesson for the reader to learn from. And so he would take several French plays and render them in like 4 or 5 pages in a collection, literally a livre de poche, and then that would be circulated and people would read them. And these were very, very popular. And then, at the same time, by the same publishing house, you would have his translation of André Gide's Theseus and Oedipus. And that was a very sophisticated translation with an introduction that I spend half of the chapter trying to understand, because in that, he's talking about fate and the gods and Al-Ma'arri, and he sort of takes Gide's failed Greek subject to Al-Ma'arri. And it's a very fascinating, complex reproduction of the individual, but these are being published at the same time and being circulated at the same time. And I thought that was kind of crazy too. So I didn't have enough time to get into that so much. I footnote on it in several places, like what he was doing here versus what he was doing here. But because I was so interested in their theory of translation, I had to go, unfortunately, to the more sophisticated works that they produced. So it ended up being really elite readership. So they're all kind of reading each other and responding to one another. Less so the responses of the people, but there were responses to other forms of writing done by the same writers. Taha Hussein famously would call for debates when he was writing. He, of course, was a very prolific news writer as well. And he would ask people to send in their opinions on the Constitution, on so, you know, it's a very ripe time. Yes.
Okay, yes. So, do we have additional questions? Yes, please. Okay.
You first. Two quick questions. Concerning Taha Hussein, a newspaper editor friend told me that his book, Fashar al-Jahili, he just got all of that from some French Orientalist.
Did that what? Sorry.
Some French Orientalist.
He got what from a friend?
The Fashar al-Jahili.
There's a lot, it's a complicated,
okay. So,
I can tell you that.
Okay. Second thing, you mentioned that they're translating detective novels, and the novel itself at the time was seen as a low form, and I saw the name Jules Verne up there.
Yeah.
Was there any attentiveness to science fiction, and did the critics pan them for that, and they stopped doing it, or they just wasn't high on their priorities?
You know, Farah Antoun wrote Al-Ilm wad-Din, which is a sci-fi in my opinion, back in 1903, where the protagonist and his friend go traveling to different imagined socialist utopias that fail. So I don't think that sci-fi necessarily is such an alien genre to Arabic and the Arabic tradition. I mean, imagination is imagination. So even if you think of the tales of the Arabian Nights, and I think the Arab audience would not have been repelled by sci-fi. But it wasn't something necessarily. It was more travel literature, I would say, was more interesting to them and more popular from the findings, and detective fiction. Detective fiction was just, you know, it was serialized, so people would wait for the next crime and wait to solve this and wait. And this is, of course, the age of, you know, new science coming in, new laws of investigation, new methods of investigation, as we know from Khalid Fahmi's books and new book. So that seems to have taken precedent, I would say, over sci-fi. But sci-fi was not something alien at all.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit, for those of us like myself who are ignorant, could you tell us a little bit more about al-Manfaluti's process, in that you said that he did not know any other language, but he was taking the information from people who sort of translated off the cuff from another text.
Exactly.
So was he working with specific people, and that, you know, does he acknowledge them, or is this something that, you know, that's all behind the curtain, and he takes it upon himself that what he produces you know, magically comes from this other source, and that he offers it? I mean, could you just tell us a little bit more about that process?
Absolutely. The process is exactly how you described it. He gives his best friend, who did him massive favors, was someone called Fuad Bek, and he got most of his stories from him. He doesn't give him credit. We know this from other sources. But then Manfaluti doesn't give Chateaubriand credit. Like, you know, it took me a long time to kind of discover that he means Atala when he's, you know. So I don't think credit was on his agenda. And I do talk about, it's actually interesting, I talk about that at the beginning of the chapter 2 with Aqad and Mazini, because as-sirqa al-adabiyya is not alien to the Arabic tradition, right? And so this idea of sirqa but making it better is okay. You know, it's not plagiarism. But it is plagiarism in their context, because this is also the age of, you know, the coming of the rights of the author, and the author as, you know, copyright holder and all that kind of stuff. But I think for him, it's like you hear a story, you tell it. Like that's, you know. And that was his process. And he heard from different people. Sometimes he would ask people. He would commission them to like translate something, but it was always oral. So they would read it in the French, and then they would compose it, and then they would relay it to him. And that's his sense of getting the impression of the text, rather than fully reading the text and then rendering it. That was his performative. That's how he performed his theory of translation, literally, in his body. And it's interesting because everyone who critiques Manfaluti critiques his body. Like, they all... Kilito, for example, describes how Manfaluti wears an Azharite cloak to mask his European self. And Mazini and Aqad will say the same. They will attack the person of Al-Manfaluti and not his work. And it's fascinating. Like, there's this association between his lived performance and himself as a writer, and not enough attention to his actual work, like what he actually produces from this kind of distance and process. And so thank you for that question, actually.
Okay, any additional questions, comments, contributions? Yeah?
Just
Richard, yeah?
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm wondering, two things jump to my mind around prophecy and the inspired figure, whether it's the artist, whether it's the religious reformer. I guess first and most simply is the idea of a prophet as a very sort of, not a reformer, but a prophet as kind of the wild man who comes in from, down the mountain and is extremely disruptive, right? So is there's social critique involved. There's the critique of kind of a self-satisfied culture that the wild prophet, comes and attacks and is there to overturn. And I'm wondering how resonant that is, that really disruptive. I mean, versus kind of like social critique of hierarchy or something. But I mean, these figures are traditionally, right, wild and frighteningly disruptive figures. And I'm wondering sort of how far that is taken up. And a quick second connection, really, this is me kind of thinking out loud on these wonderful insights that you've provided, is about inspiration, right, and revelation. And when we think back into sort of classical Islamic conceptions, right, of the nature of revelation, right, there's plenty of discussion in like theories about jazz and about the nature of the Quran, and right, that distinguish between the revelation as a sort of unreachable kind of meaning that's out there, but that finds a way down into human language through various, whether it's the recorded tablet and then the angel and then the prophet. So it's and debates around who actually turned the revelation into human words and when did that actually happen in that process. That all seems to be echoed here. And around right, the idea for sort of agency, right, and acting as the link, right, grounding these truths into real language here and now that humans can use versus the divine. I mean, but sorry, and all that. So all of that's going on, and I would want to look at Manfaluti and his theories and how much he's drawing on Mutazilite, like 1,000-year-old, distinctions being made about language and meaning, right? I'd be fascinated to see how he's digging into that material.
I thought about that a lot, and I try to do a little bit of that kind of hypothesizing in the chapter, particularly with Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. We don't really know what he was reading. which is why it was a footnote and not more than that. We know he went to Al-Azhar for 10 years, so we know we had Islamic education. But in terms of, and we do know that these texts were being reprinted as of the late 19th century. So he must have had access, but we don't know. Like, I can't really know for sure if he had read them or he had been versed in them or not. It does sound like he was in many cases, particularly when he talks about ifda and this kind of how you receive something and how it comes out and what language has to do with that. Sounds very similar, not very much, but very similar to that body of work, but I can't know for sure. But that's one thing. In terms of the rebels, they were definitely not rebels. They were reformists, but not rebels. They were part of government. I mean, Haykal was Minister of Education, Hussein was Minister of Education, he was the cultural advisor to the Wafid, he was, you know, like, they worked from within the system, not from outside the system. So Sibai, for example, like, famously stood up one day and, like, almost, I think he threw something at Officer Dunlop, who was in the colonial school. He studied at Madrasat al-Muallimin, and then he was kicked out and he wasn't given a visa to go study in England. Like, so you have these moments of, like, sometimes more obvious than others, of resistance to a certain status quo. But for the most part, we know that Manfaluti was a supporter of Muhammad Abdu all the way. But then that he also critiqued that. So it's hard to tell. Like, it's hard to position them in one place, because I don't like that. Because I also think that even though he believed in that project of reform, he didn't actually take it up entirely as it was. He modified it, and he had his own other theories, especially very different from Muhammad Abdu in very specific ways. So, but they're not rebels. I will say that. They were not. They are within and working within a system. Yeah, absolutely. But language promised that for them, I think. And translation made that possible because it was coming from somewhere else. And they could distance it from the status quo that they were in. So they might not come from the wilderness, but language might.
Okay, yes, a question.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for being here and braving the rain for us.
Pleasure.
I'm curious about your choice to focus on modern Egyptian literature and what that framing of it does to this work, as opposed to looking regionally or looking linguistically at Arabic literature. Or I guess to ask it a little differently, how were these writers and translators seeing themselves in their work? Were they seeing their work as contributing specifically to Egyptian literature as opposed to Arabic literature more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question. Practical answer, book publishers tend to like you to be focused. My dissertation covered Lebanese, Palestinian, and Egyptian translations. It was massive. The book had to focus on, find a way to frame it. This is one practical answer. The other answer is because Egypt was the hub in the early 20th century and late 19th, it was where most of the action was happening and most of the publications were happening. In the first chapter of the book, I get into a comparison between the translations being done in Egypt and those being done in Greater Syria, and those being done by the Lebanese Syrian immigrants in Cairo. So I look at the different styles, the different choices, what they were interested in. It's really very interesting, the differences. One, because of their Christian versus Islamic education, but that's not just the reason. There are many other ways, and the attitude towards language was different. You know, you find that in Greater Syria, there was a lot more comfort using al-Ammiya, and bringing in taboo subjects in translations, like social critique within the novel, and less so in Egypt, where we see much more of like moral language in Manfaluti and his popularity. So you do see that. And it's hard to cover all of it fairly, which is why I was much more interested in the question of genre and what literary language can do. And to focus it in that way, choosing one part of the world seemed to make that a little bit easier. What was it? They thought, okay, so the other question is super interesting. I think Egyptian, I think they saw themselves as, they were pretty national. I mean, you know, and I get into that a lot in the book, like their concern was Egypt. One of the major problems that Haykal will have with Rousseau is that Rousseau believed in universal education and like a and Haykal, no. Like for Haykal, education must be nationalist. And it's fascinating. His tarjama of the life of Rousseau is really fascinating. He brings in Hayy ibn Yaqzan with Robinson Crusoe and says if they were both found on an island together, they would have to work together with the context of the island. So there's this like preoccupation with context and this idea that you can only tell history through context, through where you are and who you are speaking as. So I think they were speaking to and for Egyptian literature, which is why I called the book The Making of Modern Egyptian and focused on them. I think the movement in other places looked quite different for different reasons, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, are there any additional questions or comments or contributions? Okay, so if not, I think we can end this wonderful lecture here. Before ending, I would like as well to announce our next lecture this fall, so a very important event to celebrate the 10 years of the Center for Translation Studies. Featuring a panel of distinguished speakers. This will take place on December 10. Okay, so I hope we will see you there and we can continue the conversation with Maya. There is tea and coffee outside, so I invite you to have tea and coffee outside and to continue the conversation. Thank you to all of you and thank you to Dr. Maya Kisrawani.
Thank you. Thank you so much.